Good evening, my friends. My name is Dalton Reed, and I welcome you once again to Harbor Lights. Tonight, before we begin, I'd like you to do something simple for me. Slow down. The world asks a great deal from people these days. Too much noise. Too many hurried footsteps racing toward tomorrow. But not tonight. Tonight, the sea keeps a different kind of time. So dim the lights a little. Settle into your favorite chair. Maybe pour yourself something warm and relaxing. And listen closely to the soft jazz drifting somewhere beyond the fog. Out there in the darkness, our ship sails quietly across the Atlantic. Windows glowing softly against the midnight sea. Passengers wandering polished hallways beneath warm amber light. Strangers carrying pieces of their old lives from one shoreline to the next. That's the thing about ocean voyages. Sometimes, somewhere between departure and arrival, people change. So come aboard now, my friends. Leave the shore behind for a little while and join me for another crossing into the warm lights, quiet conversations, and timeless romance of Harbor Lights. The Celestia departed the harbor shortly after dusk, beneath low Atlantic clouds and cold drifting rain. From the shoreline, the ship looked almost unreal. A glowing white ocean liner slowly disappearing into fog, while harbor lights shimmered across wet black water. Passengers gathered quietly along the outer decks beneath blankets and long coats, while distant music drifted from somewhere deeper inside the ship. Some people boarded ships to see the world. Others boarded hoping to leave part of themselves behind. Among the passengers was Thomas Grayson, architect, 43 years old, traveling alone. At least that was the story he offered the world. Thomas spent most of the evening wandering the quieter outer decks while rain drifted across the Atlantic in soft silver lines. And somewhere near the stern promenade, he noticed Evelyn for the first time. She stood alone beneath the covered deck lights, watching the harbor disappear into fog. Dark hair, green shawl, calm, distant eyes. She looked less like someone beginning a voyage, and more like someone quietly escaping one. Thomas never spoke to her that night. Neither did she speak to him. But sometimes a story begins long before the first words are ever exchanged. Far behind them, the harbor lights faded slowly into darkness. And somewhere ahead, the Atlantic waited. By the second evening, aboard the Celestia, the Atlantic had settled into a long, steady rhythm beneath the ship. Rain drifted softly across the promenade windows, while passengers filled the lounges with quiet conversation and low candlelit laughter. Thomas spent most of the evening pretending he wasn't looking for Evelyn. Eventually, he found her standing alone along the enclosed promenade deck, watching rain slide across the glass. This time, he walked over. Their first conversation was cautious, polite, careful in the way strangers often are when they sense something fragile beginning to form between them. Evelyn spoke little about herself. Thomas spoke even less. Neither seemed interested in impressing the other. That was rare. As the evening continued, conversation slowly became easier. Not dramatic, not life-changing. Just two tired people allowing silence to exist comfortably between them. Outside, Atlantic rain rolled steadily across the glass, while somewhere deeper in the ship, a small jazz trio played softly into the night. Before leaving for the evening, Evelyn quietly admitted she preferred storms at sea to sunny weather in port. When Thomas asked why, she thought about the answer for several seconds before finally smiling faintly. Storms don't ask people to pretend they're happy. Thomas quietly laughed at that. Not because it was funny, because somehow he understood exactly what she meant. And for the first time since boarding the Celestia, the voyage no longer felt quite so lonely. The third evening aboard the Celestia arrived beneath heavy Atlantic fog. Outside, sea and sky had disappeared almost entirely into gray, while the ship's horn echoed softly through the mist at slow, measured intervals. Inside, however, the ship felt warmer than ever. Passengers gathered beneath amber light and polished brass, while quiet laughter drifted through the lounges alongside the scent of coffee and aged wood. And once again, Thomas found himself searching for Evelyn before he even realized he was doing it. He eventually found her standing near the observation windows outside the orchestra lounge, watching fog drift slowly across the glass. Neither seemed surprised to see the other anymore. That part had already passed. The orchestra began playing shortly afterward. Slow piano, muted trumpet, soft brushed drums drifting through the lounge like memory. There are moments in life when people slowly stop performing the versions of themselves they normally offer the world. And somewhere between the music and the fog beyond the windows, Thomas and Evelyn had quietly begun reaching that point. Most of the evening passed in comfortable conversation beneath soft ship lights. Evelyn briefly spoke about singing in clubs years earlier. Thomas admitted he sometimes missed designing buildings more than the people connected to them. Neither judged the unfinished parts of the other's life. that was rare. As the evening continued, passengers slowly drifted toward dance floors, while others disappeared into card rooms and midnight lounges deeper within the ship. Thomas noticed Evelyn quietly watching the dancers. When he asked if she missed the music, Evelyn took several thoughtful seconds before answering. She admitted she didn't miss performing nearly as much as she missed the woman she used to be back when she believed the music would last forever. Thomas never tried to reassure her. Some answers deserved silence more than comfort. Near the end of the evening, the fog outside had grown so dense the Celestia felt almost suspended in nothingness. Passengers had mostly disappeared by then. Only scattered conversations and fading piano notes remained beneath the warm lights of the nearly empty lounge. Thomas and Evelyn eventually stood together near the promenade windows, watching rain slide slowly down the glass. Then quietly, almost carefully, Evelyn admitted she was glad she had boarded the ship. Thomas met her eyes for a long moment before answering softly, "So am I." And somewhere beyond the fog, the Atlantic carried the Celestia steadily onward through the dark. Morning arrived quietly aboard the Celestia, not with sunlight, not with warmth, but with fog. Heavy Atlantic fog surrounded the ship sometime before dawn, while sea and sky disappeared into one endless gray horizon. Even the ship's horn sounded softer this morning. Long, low echoes drifting through the mist at measured intervals. Inside the ship, however, warmth still lingered. Passengers moved quietly through breakfast lounges beneath amber light and polished brass, while distant piano music drifted softly through the corridors. And somewhere along the forward promenade deck, Thomas stood alone, watching the ocean vanish into fog. He hadn't slept much the night before. Not after Evelyn. Not after realizing that somewhere during this voyage, he had started wondering what happened after the crossing ended. Soft footsteps approached behind him. Thomas didn't turn immediately. He already knew. Evelyn stepped beside him beneath the pale promenade lamps, her green shawl wrapped gently around her shoulders, while ocean mist moved softly through her dark hair. For several moments, neither spoke. They simply watched the Atlantic together. Silence no longer felt uncomfortable between them. That part had already passed. Eventually, Evelyn quietly observed that Thomas had a habit of disappearing for long stretches aboard the ship. Thomas admitted she seemed to do the same. But Evelyn gently pointed out there was a difference between them. To her, Thomas looked like a man trying to outrun something. When Thomas quietly asked what she herself was running from, Evelyn took a long moment before answering. She admitted that sometimes she disappeared because she was trying to remember who she used to be. Thomas absorbed that answer quietly. Some truths arrived softly, like fog. The ship's horn echoed once again somewhere beyond the mist. Low, lonely, beautiful. Thomas eventually asked if Evelyn had ever noticed how much easier people found it to tell the truth at sea. When she asked why he thought that was, Thomas stared quietly toward the endless gray horizon before answering. Because there's nowhere else left to go. For the first time since boarding the Celestia, Evelyn laughed softly enough for only him to hear. And somehow, the distance between them seemed smaller now. Old harbors taught people certain things over the years. Ships had moods, and sometimes they carried stories long before the passengers realized they were living inside one. Far below the fog, two lonely people stood together at the edge of the Atlantic, pretending they weren't already falling in love. And somewhere beyond the mist, the Celestia carried them steadily onward through the dark. By the fifth evening aboard the Celestia, the Atlantic storm had fully arrived. Rain moved steadily across the outer decks, while waves rolled heavily against the hull beneath darkening sky. Most passengers had retreated indoors by nightfall. Cocktail lounges filled early. Card rooms stayed crowded. And the orchestra played longer than usual, as if trying to outrun the weather outside. Thomas eventually found Evelyn inside the enclosed rain lounge near the upper promenade decks. The room was nearly empty. Only soft piano music and rain against glass remained beneath the dim amber lighting. Evelyn sat near the windows, wrapped in her green shawl, while storm water drifted down the glass behind her in silver lines. For several moments, neither spoke. By now, they no longer seemed to require words immediately. Thomas eventually sat across from her, while the ship rolled gently beneath the storm. Outside, Atlantic rain blurred the world into shadow and light. Inside, the lounge felt strangely untouched by time. There are moments during long voyages when ships begin separating people from the lives waiting for them back on land. And somewhere during the crossing, Thomas and Evelyn had quietly begun drifting into that feeling. Most of the evening passed in quiet conversation, not the kind people use to impress each other. The other kind, the honest kind. Evelyn admitted she had almost canceled the voyage before departure. Thomas confessed he nearly had as well. Neither explained why immediately. Some stories took longer to reach the surface. Outside, lightning flashed somewhere deep beyond the fog, while the ship's horn echoed low across the Atlantic. Thomas eventually asked Evelyn if she planned on returning home once the voyage ended. Evelyn stared quietly toward the rain-covered glass for several long seconds before answering. I'm not completely sure where home is anymore. Thomas understood that answer more than he wanted to admit. As the evening slowly disappeared into night, more passengers drifted out of the lounge until only scattered conversations remained beneath the fading music. Thomas and Evelyn eventually stood together beside the rain-streaked promenade windows, watching the Atlantic storm move endlessly through the darkness. Then, quietly, almost thoughtfully, Evelyn leaned slightly closer toward him. Not dramatically, not cautiously, just naturally. And for the first time since boarding the Celestia, Thomas stopped feeling like he was traveling alone. Beyond the storm, the Atlantic carried the ship steadily onward through the night. The storm finally began easing sometime after midnight. Rain still drifted across the Atlantic in soft silver lines, but the violent wind had faded into something quieter now, more distant, more tired. Most of the passengers aboard the Celestia had already disappeared into their cabins by then. Only the late-night lounges remained awake beneath the warm, amber glow of the ship's interior lights. And somewhere along the upper observation deck, Thomas found Evelyn standing alone beneath the covered promenade overhang, watching the ocean move through darkness. For several moments, neither spoke. The Atlantic handled the conversation well enough on its own. Below them, black waves rolled endlessly beneath scattered reflections from the ship's lights, while fog drifted low across the water. Evelyn eventually admitted she had always loved ships at night. Not because they were beautiful, because they felt temporary. That answer lingered between them quietly. There are people who spend most of their lives believing they were never meant to stay anywhere too long. Evelyn sounded like one of them. Thomas leaned quietly against the rail beside her while rain tapped softly against the metal deck above. Then, almost unexpectedly, Evelyn spoke about her husband for the first time. Not in detail, not dramatically, just enough. She admitted he had died several years earlier. And ever since then, every city eventually started feeling the same. Thomas never interrupted her. Some grief sounded quieter when spoken at sea. The ship's horn echoed once somewhere beyond the darkness. Low, lonely, familiar. Thomas finally admitted he understood more than she probably realized. He told her there were entire years of his life he barely remembered anymore. Years spent designing buildings, attending meetings, shaking hands, smiling at people, while quietly feeling absent from all of it. Evelyn listened carefully without speaking. That was becoming her gift, knowing when silence mattered more than answer. Far below them, Atlantic water crashed softly against the hull, while fog drifted endlessly beyond the railings. Then quietly, almost carefully, Thomas admitted something he hadn't expected to say aloud. "I think this voyage may have found me before I was ready for it." Evelyn looked toward him for several long seconds before smiling faintly. "Maybe that's why people board ships." Thomas smiled softly at that. And somewhere between the fog, the rain, and the endless Atlantic night, the distance between them grew smaller once again. Long after midnight, the Celestia continued west through dark water beneath fading storm clouds. And somewhere aboard the ship, two lonely people had quietly stopped pretending they were strangers. The Atlantic storm had finally passed. The sea still rolled beneath the ship in long, dark swells, but the rain was gone now. Only fog remained drifting softly beyond the promenade windows. Inside the orchestra lounge, however, the mood aboard the ship had changed completely. Passengers filled the dance floor beneath warm amber light, while glasses clinked softly against polished tables and the orchestra drifted through slow midnight jazz. For the first time in days, the Celestia felt alive again. Thomas and Evelyn sat together near the rear edge of the lounge while couples moved slowly across the dance floor beneath soft gold lighting. Evelyn seemed quieter than usual that evening. Not distant, just thoughtful. Then, sometime near the middle of the orchestra's second set, something unexpected happened. The bandleader paused briefly between songs while scanning the room beyond the stage lights. And then, he smiled. Very gently, very knowingly. He had recognized Evelyn. Not immediately, but eventually. Years earlier, somewhere along another Atlantic crossing, she had apparently sung with the orchestra for nearly an entire summer season. Thomas saw surprise cross her face the moment the bandleader spoke quietly toward her from the stage. At first, she shook her head politely. The bandleader smiled again, patiently, as though he already knew she would eventually say yes. Several minutes later, Evelyn finally stood. Not dramatically, not nervously, almost reluctantly. The orchestra softened into a slow piano introduction, while passengers gradually turned their attention toward the stage. And then Evelyn began to sing. Softly at first. The kind of voice that didn't demand attention, the kind that quietly earned it. The lounge slowly fell silent around her. Even the Atlantic beyond the windows seemed quieter somehow. Thomas watched her carefully beneath the warm orchestra lights, while fragments of the woman she used to be slowly returned with every verse. Not the loneliness, not the grief, the other parts, the confidence, the elegance. The life she thought had disappeared somewhere.
What'll I do? What'll I do with just my troubles too. When I'm alone with all.
By the time the song ended, the lounge remained silent for several seconds before applause finally rose softly through the room. But Evelyn barely seemed to notice the audience. Her eyes had already found Thomas again. And for the first time since boarding the Celestia, he saw her smile without sadness behind it. Later that evening, long after the orchestra resumed playing and the passengers returned to dancing, Thomas quietly admitted he finally understood something. Evelyn looked toward him curiously. Thomas smiled faintly. The music never left you. For several seconds, Evelyn said nothing. Then softly, almost to herself, she answered, "No, I think I left it." Beyond the glowing windows of the orchestra lounge, the Atlantic carried the Celestia steadily west beneath drifting fog and scattered stars. And somewhere between the music and the sea, something inside Evelyn had quietly begun returning home. The Atlantic was calm again by dawn. Not completely still. The ocean never truly became still, but calmer than it had been in days. Soft morning light drifted slowly across the horizon, while the Celestia moved steadily west through pale silver fog. Most passengers were still asleep when Thomas stepped quietly onto the forward promenade deck, carrying 2 cups of coffee. He found Evelyn exactly where he expected to. Standing alone near the railings beneath the fading deck lamps, watching morning slowly arrive across the Atlantic. Neither spoke immediately. By now, silence between them had become something comfortable, something trusted. Thomas eventually handed her one of the coffees, while cold sea air drifted softly through the promenade deck. Evelyn smiled faintly. "You're starting to predict where I'll be." Thomas leaned quietly against the railing beside her. "You're not very difficult to find anymore." That answer stayed between them for a while. Below the ship, long dark swells rolled endlessly beneath the morning fog, while distant gulls occasionally appeared beside the railings before disappearing once again into mist. There are moments during long voyages when people quietly realize they are no longer the same person who boarded the ship days earlier. Thomas was beginning to understand that feeling now. For several long minutes, they simply watched the sunrise slowly emerge through the fog. Then Evelyn admitted something she hadn't expected to feel again. Hope. Not dramatic hope. Not reckless hope. Just the quiet, dangerous kind that slowly returns when loneliness begins loosening its grip on someone's life. Thomas understood immediately. Some emotions required no translation at sea. Far below them, Atlantic water moved softly against the hull, while the Celestia continued carrying hundreds of strangers toward lives waiting somewhere beyond the horizon. But somewhere during the crossing, Thomas and Evelyn had quietly stopped feeling like strangers themselves. Eventually, Evelyn glanced toward him carefully. What happens when the voyage ends? Thomas stared quietly toward the pale morning horizon before answering. I honestly don't know. For once, neither of them tried pretending that answer didn't frighten them a little. As the sun slowly climbed above the Atlantic fog, golden light spilled gently across the promenade deck around them. And for a brief moment, the entire world felt suspended somewhere between departure and arrival, between who they had been and who they might still become. Far ahead of them, beyond the endless Atlantic horizon, land waited patiently in the distance. By the ninth evening, aboard the Celestia, word had quietly begun spreading through the ship that land would be visible by morning. Passengers lingered longer along the outer decks that night. Some stood alone beneath blankets and overcoats, watching fog drift across the Atlantic. Others filled the lounges, pretending they weren't already thinking about arrival. Voyages changed people, but harbors forced them to decide what came next. Thomas found Evelyn standing near the stern rail shortly after sunset, while cold ocean wind moved softly through the dark folds of her shawl. Far behind them, the Atlantic disappeared endlessly into darkness. Far ahead, faint, scattered harbor lights had just begun appearing through the fog, like distant stars resting on the horizon. For several moments, neither spoke. The closer the ship moved toward land, the more fragile silence between them suddenly felt. Eventually, Evelyn admitted she had been dreading this part of the voyage since waking that morning. Not because she feared arriving, because she feared losing whatever the crossing had become. Thomas understood immediately. Some things only existed while ships remained at sea. Below them, dark water rolled softly against the hull, while the Celestia continued west toward the growing lights ahead. Passengers moved quietly along the decks around them now. Laughter softer than before. Conversations shorter, almost as though the ship itself understood the voyage was ending. Thomas eventually admitted something he had been avoiding for days. He told Evelyn he no longer wanted to return to the life waiting for him ashore, exactly as he had left it. Evelyn listened carefully without interrupting. Then quietly, almost cautiously, she admitted she felt the same. For a long moment, neither looked away. There are certain conversations people only find the courage to have when surrounded by ocean and distance. This was becoming one of them. Far ahead, the harbor lights slowly grew brighter through the fog, while the ship's horn echoed low across the dark Atlantic night. Low, lonely, beautiful. Eventually, Thomas asked the question both of them had quietly been avoiding since the beginning of the voyage. What happens tomorrow? Evelyn stared toward the approaching shoreline for several long seconds before answering. "I don't know yet." Then softly, almost carefully, she reached for his hand. And this time, Thomas didn't let go. Beyond the fog, the harbor lights waited patiently along the dark Atlantic coast, while the Celestia carried its passengers steadily toward morning. Morning arrived beneath low silver clouds and calm Atlantic water. From the outer decks of the Celestia, the harbor slowly emerged through drifting fog while tugboats moved quietly across the bay beneath pale dawn light. Passengers lined the railings, carrying suitcases, newspapers, overcoats, and the strange silence that always seemed to accompany arrival. By now, the voyage belonged more to memory than reality. Thomas stood along the promenade deck, watching the shoreline slowly grow clearer through the mist. Warehouses, street lamps, church towers, harbor cafes beginning to wake beneath the early morning rain. The Atlantic crossing was ending. And somehow, that thought felt heavier than he expected. A few moments later, Evelyn appeared beside him carrying the same green shawl she had worn the night they first saw each other aboard the ship. For several seconds, neither spoke. The harbor handled the conversation well enough on its own. Below them, ropes were already being prepared along the forward decks, while crew members moved briskly through the morning fog. Passengers nearby spoke about trains, hotels, families, business meetings, and destinations waiting somewhere beyond the docks. But for Thomas and Evelyn, the future suddenly felt far less certain than the voyage itself ever had. Eventually, Evelyn smiled faintly while watching rain slide softly across the promenade windows. "I think part of me wanted this crossing to last forever." Thomas understood that feeling completely. Some places only existed while people were passing through them. Ships, storms, certain conversations after midnight, and sometimes certain people. The Celestia's horn echoed one final time across the harbor. Beautiful. Then quietly, almost carefully, Thomas turned toward Evelyn. "What if this isn't the end of the story?" Evelyn looked at him for several long seconds while fog drifted slowly across the harbor behind them. Then, for the first time since boarding the ship, she answered without hesitation. "Then don't let it become one." An hour later, passengers slowly began disappearing down the gangway into the waking harbor below. Some would remember the crossing for only a few days, others for the rest of their lives. Thomas and Evelyn stepped onto the dock together sometime near the end of the morning, beneath soft Atlantic rain and fading fog. No promises, no dramatic declarations. Just two people quietly walking toward an uncertain shoreline, no longer feeling quite so alone. And behind them, the Celestia rested silently beside the harbor, while gulls circled above the water and morning rain drifted softly across the Atlantic. The voyage was over, but somewhere beyond the fog, something else had quietly begun. And so, the Celestia found her harbor once again. Some passengers left carrying souvenirs, some carried memories, and a fortunate few left carrying something far more rare: hope. Life has a remarkable way of moving quietly when we aren't paying attention. Sometimes, the most important journeys begin long after we believe our story has already been written. And sometimes, beneath moonlight, music, and distant harbor lights, two people find each other exactly when they were meant to. Thank you for joining me aboard Harbor Lights. I truly hope you enjoyed the voyage. And friends, if you have someone you love them well. Love them deeply. Love them while you can. And if you haven't yet found that person, don't stop looking. Life has a remarkable way of bringing people together when they least expect it. Somewhere out there, someone may be searching for you too. Until next time, may your seas remain calm, your heart remain open, and your journey always lead you somewhere worth remembering. I'm Dalton Reed. Good night, my friends.